Pre-Columbian Americas. There you are. The use of the word America is a bit confusing because it wasn't named America. The continent of the Americas was not named America until the voyages of Amerigo Vespucci in the 16th century, in the 1500s. A navigator who sailed all around Cape Horn, south of South America, and named the land America, or the land was named after him, Amerigo Vespucci. So there's a little bit of a complication with the use of the word Americas. But let me just tell you a few things just to put you in the picture. 1492 was the year of discovery of Christopher Columbus. Of course, that's also a misnomer because many people had travelled across the Atlantic before Columbus, not least the Vikings, and in fact there are archaeological remains in Newfoundland and the northern part, the northeast of the United States and Canada, of the Vikings. So one of the first things you need to just cast out of your mind is the idea that Christopher Columbus discovered America. He didn't discover America for many reasons. First of all, there were many people living there, so those people, one would assume, had already discovered the place they were living. Second of all, as I said, evidence of voyages of Europeans prior to Columbus. And thirdly, he didn't discover America because, as I just said, it wasn't called America then. But here's some interesting facts. In 1491, so before Columbus, there were probably more people, in fact there were definitely more people living in the Americas than the whole of Europe. Now fair enough, it was a much bigger landmass, but it was a very densely populated land. Certain cities, and there were many cities as we'll see, such as Tenochtitlan, and Tenochtitlan is what modern day Mexico City. They were greater in population than any contemporary European city. So when Hernán Cortés in the 1520s arrived in Tenochtitlan, it was bigger than any European city at the time. Just worth pointing that one out. And it had a very sophisticated civic infrastructure. And notice the word is already coming up. Civic administration. It had running water and sanitation and sewerage and a very elaborate agricultural system in the surrounding lake and in the surrounding lands. Here's something you'll probably find interesting. The earliest cities in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, were probably thriving before the Egyptians built the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau near Cairo. So we're talking great antiquity, something that also needs to be addressed. Very sophisticated use of agriculture. Indeed, the development of corn, maize, is so complex and sophisticated that it's actually being called it's being called the earliest example of genetic engineering. That's to say, the development of the agricultural use of corn demonstrates great sophistication of the use of plants and the actual manipulation of the very growing material of these plants, going back many thousands of years. Interesting looking at the Amazon rainforest that we very often think of as virgin. We very often refer to the virgin rainforest. But there's a lot of indication to suggest that the many, many cultures who've been living there for many thousands of years have been managing the rainforest in the same way that we manage our landscape, agriculturally. And that actually it's a very managed, rather like the bleed. The rainforest is actually a very well managed environment. And indeed it's difficult to explore the full architecture, the full archaeology of the Amazon because it gets surrounded by the vegetation so quickly in such a fertile land. But the full history of the Amazon is actually still quite hazy. It's not been fully explored. There's evidence to suggest that people have been in the Americas since the end of the last ice age. So we're talking around 12,000 years ago, but further back, perhaps going back to 18,000 years ago. And still the dominant narrative is that people entered the Americas through the Bering Strait, which is between Alaska and Russia. and that people walked down through a particular land corridor. Well, first of all, a land corridor of the Bering Strait, because it was the ice age, so there was more ice, so the sea levels were lower, and people walked across. But there is evidence that, despite that's the case, there's also evidence to suggest that people were crossing the oceans, and I'll come to that later on. So that's not the exclusive entrance of people into the Americas. There's evidence of agriculture going back 7,000 or 8,000 years in the Americas, which is contemporary with the development of agriculture in Europe and the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent. So again, very interesting how ancient the human population of the Americas is. Ceramics have been found from 6,000 BCE. By the way, during the presentation I'll be using the word BCE and CE. You may have come across this before. Do you remember we've traditionally used the word AD and BC? AD meaning, anyone know?
Anno Domini?
Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. And BC meaning before Christ. But because we're not predominantly a Christian society anymore, we tend to use in academic circles, and actually wider circles, we tend to use CE and BCE, which is Common Era and before the Common Era. Okay, so BCE is what was BC, and CE is what was AD. Okay, you'll probably now that I've said this, you'll probably see this everywhere. So this is an interesting one. There's an estimate that the population of the Americas was around 40 million people at the time of Columbus's arrival in 1492. 40 million people over the whole of the Americas. Now, of course, it's a very difficult one to get the full figures, but it is an interesting one to see quite how extensive the populations were. And it's likely that 3/4 of the population of the Americas were in Central America, what's called Mesoamerica, and South America, in particular in the Andean regions. So, this is the 4 voyages. These are the 4 voyages of Columbus in 1492. I'm just going to show you that because I want you to see where he went. You can see that he went to the island of Hispaniola, which is current modern-day Dominican Republic and Haiti, and Cuba. You can see that long island there of Cuba. And on his 4th voyage, he explored down Mesoamerica, the Central American Isthmus, going down Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Belize, these different modern-day countries, right the way down to the northern point of Colombia. So who did he encounter? Who was living there at the time? Well, these are some of the people. You can see the Taino. The Taino are the people who inhabited the northern islands of the Caribbean, in particular Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, well, modern-day Jamaica and Puerto Rico. So this is Puerto Rico, this is the island of Hispaniola, Dominican Republic and Haiti, that's Cuba there. We also have the Guanacatabey, otherwise known as the Siboney. Buenos dias. And we have many other names, including the Caribs. Now, the Caribs are what obviously give their name to the Caribbean, but they also give their name to cannibal because of the legends that abounded in the early time of exploration of these ferocious, warlike people who ate their enemies. The truth of the matter is probably a little bit more complex than that. But we can immediately see that there are lots of names that are given to different peoples, and as we look down the coastline, we can see some other people. This is all the time of Columbus. We're looking at some extremely old, sorry, this has still got BC and AD. Old peoples. We've got Olmecs, Maya, Aztecs, Chimu, Inca in particular. These are the people we're going to be exploring now. Okay, so these are some of the names. There are many more names. We're going to start the presentation by looking at the pre-Columbian civilizations of Mesoamerica. You can see that's the modern-day United States, that's Mexico. Okay, that's Colombia moving over to Venezuela. You can see where we are. This is the Caribbean, there's Cuba again. That's Florida. Okay, this is the Central American Isthmus. This is Mesoamerica. The people from there are generally referred to as Mesoamerican. And the Aztecs. So let's just talk a little bit about these people. I'll just go back a second. The ancient peoples of Mexico, Central America, are collectively known as Mesoamericans and identified by various shared cultural, artistic and religious characteristics. Now let's just look at some of the identifying features of these peoples. The only domesticated animals were turkeys and dogs, so the whole question of the domestication of horses and cows and goats and sheep that we know elsewhere was very different in Mesoamerica. Domestication of animals wasn't a feature of their societies. Likewise, metal. Now we refer to, for example, in the rest of the world, we refer to the Stone Age, we refer to the Bronze Age, we refer to the Copper Age in times, and the Iron Age. And then we talk about the times beyond the Iron Age, which is sort of beyond the time of the Roman Empire. But actually, it's a very different situation when we're looking at the Americas, because they had the use of metals, but there's very little use of metals for any form of tooling. So that's to say, we don't see the use of metals for weapons, we don't see the use of metals for any form of building material or civic architecture. What we see predominantly across the whole of the Americas is the use of metals, in particular gold, silver and bronze, which are very soft and malleable, for ornamentation, for decoration. And perhaps, but this is moving into the realms of speculation, perhaps for some technological purposes, but we'll come to that later. Okay. What they used for weapons were hard stones, in particular obsidian. Has anyone heard of obsidian before? You have, yeah. Obsidian is a volcanic glass. It's actually a glass, it's black. I have a piece at home. I thought about bringing it along, but I forgot to. Very, very hard, black stone. It looks a bit like jet, if you've ever seen jet. But it's harder, and it was used in the same way that, for example, in Europe, flint was used for all sorts of different purposes, including weapons. Something that we'll see which is very central to all these Mesoamerican cultures was the bull game. The bull game, we'll see, because I got some photos of the bull game courts in some of the Maya ruins. And the bull game is a very important thing culturally. More than just a game, it seems to have been the enactment of some kind of cosmological drama. And very often, it could well have been the case that it was a matter of life and death. And we'll come to, yes?
But the one in the film El Dorado?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
I haven't seen the film El Dorado.
It's really good.
It's a good film, is it? Highly likely it is the game, the bull game. And we'll see it with Aztec, we'll see it with Olmec, we'll see it with Maya, Teotihuacan. It was a very predominant ritual, the bull game. Now here's an interesting one. Incredibly sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, and in particular the movement of the heavenly bodies in relation to long cycles of the heavens, such as the precession of the equinox. I'll come to that a little bit later. There's every indication to suggest that many of these cultures in not just Central America, but all over the Americas, had a very sophisticated knowledge of the movement of the heavenly bodies. We're talking about elliptical orbits, we're talking about long cycles, we're talking about the return of comets, we're talking about, obviously, a full understanding of the heliocentric nature of the galaxy, that's to say the sun is at the centre of the solar system, as opposed to the Earth. Very sophisticated, and this is encoded into their buildings, encoded into their legends. We'll come to this, but it's worth pointing out. I was wondering, for example, if anyone were to have used, when I asked for some words, for words such as primitive or savage or backward or uncivilized. Had anyone used that word, I would have raised it as an issue of, that's worth exploring. It's a very European way of looking at other cultures as being backward. But the answer is, these cultures were very sophisticated in many, many different areas. And unfortunately, so much has been lost. It's been lost for two different reasons. It's been lost because we're talking going back to great antiquity, in the case of the Olmecs, for example, before the time of the Romans, before the time of Christ. So much was already lost by the time the Spanish arrived. So had the Spanish themselves not enacted such an incredibly zealous program of destruction, then still we wouldn't know very much about, for example, the Olmecs, or the Chachapoya, or the Paracas, or the Nazca. We'll come to these people later on. But the Spanish did, and the Spanish were ferocious in their eradication of history. It leaves anyone with an interest in these matters holding their heads in lamentation to think about how these ancient sites were broken up, the petroglyphs and the hieroglyphs were erased, the codices, which were codex, which were the written documents on a particular type of parchment, were burnt. Oh, it just goes on. The level of destruction is still, despite the best interests of archaeologists, the level of destruction in the Americas of antiquity is quite shameful. It's unbelievable. And we'll be doing that in 2 weeks' time. We'll be looking into the very mindset, the religious mindset of the Spanish as to what really brought about this level of animosity to the people of the Americas. But let's get on to the Aztecs. The Aztecs, also known as the Mexica, you can see the word Mexica gives its name to Mexico. They were a people who came from the north, and in fact their name, Aztec, refers to the people of Aztlan. Aztlan, a legendary place of their homeland. Nobody knows exactly where it was. But they came south and they settled in an area around Lake Texcoco. And Lake Texcoco, they built their settlement there, and which became Tenochtitlan, which then, when the Spanish arrived, they took over the place and they have converted it into what we now know as Mexico City. Innovative farming techniques in the lake, and to such a degree that actually when the Spanish arrived, they called it they compared it to Renaissance Venice, a city built amidst the water. Sacrifice is an interesting one. We'll come to that in a second. Here's a view of Tenochtitlan. This was made by the Spanish. We can see there's on the left. We can see the lake. We can see a bit difficult to see. There is the city itself of Tenochtitlan. We can see lots of other settlements around, and here is a bigger view of it. This is an excavation in Mexico City. You can see the cathedral behind with the Zocalo in front. You can see the Zocalo of a big square. But these are some of the many ruins which are still underneath present-day Mexico City. Has anyone been to Mexico? Have you been to Mexico City? Did you see any of these ruins?
Yeah, I live.
You're from Mexico?
No. I'm from Venezuela.
You're from Venezuela? Ah, brilliant. Yeah. So in Mexico City, we'll see there are still lots of ruins that are still being excavated. Some have been covered up again, obviously, because there's a modern city there. Here is one of the codices that wasn't destroyed, showing the founding of Mexico City, and the eagle and the cactus is still the symbol of Mexico City and the Mexicans. Here's an artist's reconstruction of the city. We can see the pyramids there in the city, in the very city landscape, and you can see the outlying suburbs, and you can see obviously all the extensive water. These are the chinampas, which is their way of providing agriculture, of forming agriculture in the lake itself. And the farming method was by the use of rafts or boats. Very, very sophisticated and very effective. Here's another artistic representation of these chinampas and of the use of the agriculture. So much to feed a very large city. Now, the Aztecs and the Mexica inherited from the Maya the very sophisticated calendric system. And here is an image of one of the calendars. It's quite difficult. I mean, I can't interpret it. I'm not a scholar of these calendric systems, but I know people who are, and I've read enough to familiarize myself with the whole process. And what we're dealing with here is cyclical rather than linear. We tend to have this idea of linear time. It starts at point zero and moves progressively towards somewhere, whereas the Mesoamerican, based initially from the Olmecs, but through the Maya and through the Teotihuacan and through the Toltec to the Mexica to the Aztec, was of cycles. And as we invest further and further into this, we explore further into this, we'll see how appropriate this cyclical vision of time seems to be in terms of, for example, the rise and fall of empires, the rise and fall of technological developments, and so many things seem to follow cyclical rather than linear patterns. But this is Aztec, but you'll see it as we get onto the Maya. You'll see the similarities with the Maya. The sun at the centre. The sun is principal to the Mesoamerican civilizations. And we'll see how the question of the sun is central to their cosmology, as it is to ours, as it is to every culture, because at the end of the day, the sun is the principal source of energy for the Earth. There's a lot to talk about the calendric system, but I'll leave it for the moment, because otherwise we'll get lost in wild speculation. Here's another Aztec codex, just showing some of the features of the society at the time. It's not entirely clear what this is showing. Now, the thing about the Aztecs, and this is what we'll be looking at in 2 weeks' time, is they were fierce, they were warriors, and they were very, very powerful. And as with lots of societies in the Americas, a very pyramidical society with the emperor/god emperor at the top. At the time of Hernán Cortés, in the early 1500s, the ruler was called Moctezuma, otherwise known as Montezuma, and he had divine status. And they worshipped various gods, and the principal two gods who appear time and time again in the narratives of the Mexica, of the Aztecs, are Quetzalcoatl. Some of you may have heard of Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, the serpent with feathers, and we'll see his shadow enacted on the Maya pyramids at Tikal and at Chichen Itza. I'll come to that in a minute. And Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god. And the Aztecs defeated the neighboring cultures, the neighboring peoples, such as the Tlaxcala, in war and demanded tribute. And the tribute was sacrificial victims. Now, this has been blown up over history as being, an indication of the savagery of these people. But it's an interesting one to explore. It may have been blown up, but not necessarily out of proportion, because by so many accounts it is certainly the case that they performed human sacrifice on a fairly large scale. Now, this is one of the principal reasons whereby Hernán Cortés was able to defeat the Mexica, the Aztec, was because he brought with him numerous neighboring peoples who were indignant at the treatment they had received by the Aztecs, and so they were very happy to ally themselves with the Spanish in order to march on Tenochtitlan. So human sacrifice, it is real. It's not just some sort of crazy legend from Hollywood movies. And the depictions are really quite amazing of the removal of the human heart using an obsidian blade. I don't quite know why I put that picture there, because that's not an obsidian blade. I don't quite know what that is. But the use of an obsidian blade to go underneath the ribcage and rip out the heart from the sacrificial victims. There's some indication that sacrificial victims would have been honoured to have been the sacrificial victims, but I'm not so certain. I'm not so certain that I would like to be sacrificed. And here we can see, for example, another image done at the time of the Spanish of the victim's body being rolled down the steps and the heart being plucked out beforehand. Again, there's a lot we can explore in this, and we'll talk about this in 2 weeks' time. Here, for example, in Tenochtitlan is the Wall of Skulls. These are not real skulls; these are carvings. But the indication is quite large numbers of sacrificial victims. And here's another image. Perhaps the blood was collected in that bowl of this statue. Aztec gold, obviously this is what fueled the conquest in particular by the Spanish. They were blinded by their lust for gold, and the Aztecs had gold in great quantity, and most of it, as you probably know, was put on boats and taken back to Spain, that which wasn't plundered by Drake and Raleigh from the Spanish boats. So that's the Aztec. There's a lot we can talk about the Aztec, but I'm going to be covering a little bit more in 2 weeks' time when we look at the conquest of the Aztec. I want to move to a culture which preceded. I'm going to go back in time. That's what I was saying at the beginning. We're kind of moving from the moment of conquest of the Spanish arrival backwards in time. And as you'll see, this is what I feel particularly. This is what I particularly love about it. As we go further back in time, things just get weirder and weirder, more and more mysterious. But we'll come to that. So hang in there. We're going to be looking at the Toltecs now. Now we've got the dates of early 1900s to 1160, but again, it's quite difficult with these dates. And the reason it's difficult with these dates, and this will apply throughout this entire presentation, the reason it's difficult with these dates is because societies don't suddenly start, you know. When did the Celts begin? Well, no, the Celts didn't begin anywhere. Different people move and migrate, and there's mixing of peoples, and certain people identify themselves with a particular term. But generally we'll find that most terms that are used to describe peoples of antiquity are actually words that are used by other cultures to describe them. So, for example, the Picts. You may have heard of the Picts up in the northeast of Scotland, sort of Grampian, Aberdeen. Now, the Picts didn't call themselves a Picts. That was a Roman word to refer to the painted people, yeah, who spoke a different language. They weren't Celts, they weren't speaking Gaelic. So again, we look at the situation of when did the Picts begin? Well, the Picts didn't begin anywhere because there was no people called the Picts. This was a word that the Romans used to refer to them. Can you see where I'm going with that? So it's very difficult to say, of course, it began in 1902. It's not that simple. So when we're looking at the Toltec again, did they refer to themselves as Toltec? Did they even refer to themselves as a defined people? I mean, do we refer to ourselves as defined people? And I'm sure we've got numerous cultures here represented in this room. I'm not necessarily, we're not all English here. So it's a very difficult one to say. The Toltecs, defined people, started at a particular time and ended at a particular time. But these are rough figures and rough names. The Toltecs preceded the Aztecs, and they based their capital at Tula in Central America, also called Dojan. And at its height, it had a large population, maybe 40 or 50,000 people. And we'll see there's a lot of similarity between the Toltec and the Maya who preceded them. Here's their capital city. This is a photograph with these extraordinary statues. They're usually held to be warrior figures. They're not necessarily warrior figures. Did you go? What's your name? Sorry. Sophia. Did you go to any of these Toltec places?
No. I went to Chichen Itza.
You went to Chichen Itza, which is Maya. Muy bien, muy bien. Well, this is further north from Mexico City. And this is the first time that I bring up the situation of pyramids. There are, all over the Americas, hundreds of pyramids in varying states of decay. Hundreds, if not thousands, of pyramids. And in fact, as we get further in this presentation, I'm going to bring up the situation of pyramids all over the world and the possibility of shared communication of pyramid design. But the Toltec built pyramids, and there is an image of the pyramid in Tula. What brought about the collapse of the Toltec? Well, they were conquered by the Chichimec, but again, it's not entirely certain that would have ended a particular group of people in such a categorical way. And it's likely that many of the Toltecs moved to the area around Cholula until they were conquered by the Spanish. And Cholula is an interesting one. Sophia, did you go to Cholula?
No.
Cholula, and here it is, Cholula, it is the largest pyramid in the world. The largest pyramid in the world. And as I said, there are lots and lots of pyramids. Its real name, got to remember this, is Tlachihuatapetl. Yeah, and you might recognize that Petl because of the volcano in Mexico City is called Popocatépetl, referring to mountain. So this is actually called a mountain. It's called the artificial mountain, or the mountain made by man, Cholula. Notice what the Spanish did. again, this is a very typical Christian attitude to any pre-Christian religion, is to dominate it, to suppress it, and in particular to build a Christian temple on the existing temple. This is a case all over the British Isles. You'll see churches which have incorporated megaliths, stone circles. You'll see churches on top of former sacred hills. You'll see churches that have got holy wells that were holy wells before the church was there. It's something, wherever Christianity has appeared, it has incorporated the local religious sites as a way of maintaining that tradition rather than obliterate it entirely. So this, for many years, it wasn't even known that this was a pyramid. It was just seen to be a hill, but it's actually full of tunnels and chambers. It's a fully established pyramid such as we know in Egypt. Cholula in Mexico, and here you can see, and this is all cleared of the undergrowth, the base of the pyramid here. Going to move on. Teotihuacan, which is where Sophia went. Teotihuacan, which is, at one stage it was attributed to the Mexica, to the Aztec, but it actually was much older than the Aztec. The Aztec certainly used the site in the same way that cultures continue to use sites everywhere around the world. You don't abandon a site and start a new one. You employ the same sites for the same purposes. So Teotihuacan refers both to the place and to the people. And again, did the people themselves refer to themselves as Teotihuacan? It's not known. But we refer to the people, the Teotihuacan. And this is the Avenue of the Dead, seen from the Pyramid of the Sun. And you can see the Pyramid of the Moon there on the distance on the left. Now, Teotihuacan, it was founded in the 1st century of the Common Era. So we're looking at the time of Christ, soon after, at the time before the Christianization of the Roman Empire, for example. And at its height, there could have been 200,000 people living here. So again, a very dense city space. And it probably rose to its height in the 4th century of the Common Era, but went into decline soon after. So by 500, 600, so around the time, for example, of the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain, around this time, the Teotihuacan culture was in decline. And certainly we kind of look at certain acts, such as in 750 of the Common Era, we can see through archaeological remains that the city was burned and vandalized and destroyed, perhaps by an internal revolt. It's not entirely clear. And like the Maya, like the Toltec, like the Mexica, the Aztec, they built upon a culture already founded by the Olmec. There's the Pyramid of the Sun, and again the Pyramid of what an incredible place. Now I'll put a little thing here. The base, the ground base, the base plan of the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan is identical to the base plan of the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau. Coincidence? Who knows? It's a lot shorter. The Great Pyramid of Giza would go up to about there, but the base plan is identical. And you'll see with pyramid complexes, we'll see similar orientation of one pyramid to the other, such as we see in Giza, we'll see in numerous other locations in the Americas and actually elsewhere. Again, I'm just throwing at you the idea of very ancient communication of cultures. Here again at Teotihuacan, there's the Pyramid of the Moon, an extraordinary place. And there's another one. You can see, just if you're familiar with images of Egypt, the actual layout of these temples, with all these other little temples around and avenues, very similar to Egypt. And we're going to go back. We're going to go back to the Maya. The Maya were the sites that you visited, Sophia. This is the Yucatan Peninsula. This is the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, moving down to Belize and Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. All these different countries, modern countries, were part of the Maya lands. And the Maya is a collective name, rather like we talk about the Romans, but the Romans didn't refer to anyone who was from the city of Rome. It referred to all the different disparate peoples who were absorbed by the Roman Empire. The Maya were many different peoples, speaking many different languages with many different customs, but there was cultural similarities. There were cultural similarities across these people, which is why we can refer to the Maya as a collective people. again, as I've been saying constantly, they inherited many of their cultural features from the Olmec. City-states of great cultural sophistication, and there are around 850 of these sites that have been explored, or at least are known about. 850 different Maya sites, the most famous being Chichen Itza and Palenque. I'll show you some images now. Very extensive and very sophisticated agriculture in order to feed these city-states. Very sophisticated calendric system, as I mentioned earlier, including the long count. And again, it's worth pointing out that the Maya didn't end at a particular time. There's no sort of the Maya ended at a particular time, because in fact, when Hernán Cortés launched his exploration and then invasion of Central America, the first people he came across, the first people he met were Maya. But of course, they had long ago abandoned their temples. Many of their temples were already covered in dense undergrowth and forest and jungle. So the Maya as a civilization had long collapsed, but the Maya people still existed. They still do today. There are plenty of people speaking Quiche Maya in many parts of Central America. Here is Chichen Itza, and in fact I mentioned earlier, I should have got an image, I should have done, at particular times around the solstice, at sunset, with the sun setting, it forms the shadow of a serpent along there, or a bendy serpent. I should have got an image of it, which is very often held to be Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, and it's definitely a very distinctive feature of these temples. Here is Chichen Itza, the observatory. Now this is an observatory, there's no doubt about it. It has a particular aperture at the top there. It's an observatory such as we see in the modern world, in places like the Andes or in Hawaii or anywhere else. I mean, it's an observatory quite clearly for observing the heavens. This is the ball court. Somebody mentioned the film. This, you see, it's quite an extensive place, and the idea was to put a rubber ball through a particular hoop. This is the ball court at Chichen Itza. Here is Palenque, also in Mexico. Palenque is a very extensive site of an old city, Maya, that was all discovered and cleared in the 20th century. So a lot of these places have only been recently sort of mapped and discovered. In fact, I'll just mention that in the news just last week, the president of Honduras has just authorized an excavation of a Maya site deep in the jungle of Honduras. It's never before been excavated. So you see, these places are still being revealed. Here's Tikal in Guatemala. Again, likelihood of about 60,000 people living here. Very big. The Maya resisted the Spanish for a long time, and the Spanish had a great problem getting hold of the Maya lands because of their resistance. Here's some more of Tikal, Temple of the Masks in Tikal. Now here's when we start to look at similarities with, for example, temples in Cambodia or in Indonesia. We'll see strange similarities around the world. Rather eerie Mask of the Rain God in Tikal. Here is an image of the famous calendar from the Maya, indicating the different cyclical counts. Here are some of the Mayan glyphs. They had a very, very, very sophisticated writing system using glyphs. And when it comes to I haven't got mathematics. When it comes to mathematics, amazing. The Maya had the use of zero. Now you might say, well, fair enough, but actually in terms of the Western world, we didn't have the use of zero until people from Europe started to learn from the Arabs, in particular in Spain, something you may have covered with Montserrat yesterday. And zero was a philosophical as well as a mathematical concept really developed by the Arabs. And it obviously greatly expanded the capacity of mathematics in terms of abstract thought. We didn't have it. We didn't have it until, I don't know the exact dates, but let's imagine the 1100s. I may be wrong there. But zero was known about and used and employed in their mathematical systems a long time before by the Maya and likely by the Olmec. Chocolate was a very important thing Still is. Just want to have a little image of these cenotes. Did you visit any of these cenotes?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to go there. I haven't been there. The cenotes, I'll just show you the place. This is the Yucatan Peninsula. There's a very, very, very extensive and complex network of caves and sinkholes and passages and underwater rivers, pretty much throughout the whole of the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula. And these were sacred to the Maya. And in fact, there are lots of different parts of the cenotes that have been excavated and found to have burial goods and skeletons placed in specific locations, indicating that people actually went deep underwater in order to place these people there. Some of them have been sort of exploited to a certain degree as tourist attractions. You can see here there's some steps going down. You can get married in some of these places and have lovely wedding photos. They're beautiful places, but they're actually all interconnected with the sea eventually. And there have been divers who've been down one cenote miles inland and have connected with another, and eventually popped out in the sea. And there are bits where the fresh water and the salt water actually form distinct layers, and you can swim through these layers and you can see the seawater and the fresh water as very distinct layers within the cenote. Magical places, and they were very magical and very special to the Maya. So, finally we get to the Olmec. Okay, we're about halfway through the presentation, so I hope you're all entertained. I hope I'm not boring you. If you are bored, then just hang in there. The Olmec again. Look at the dates: 1200 BCE to 300 BCE. I mean, this is very ancient. This is when we're looking. This is Old Testament time. Very little is known about the Olmecs. They're very often called the mother culture of later Central American, Mesoamerican civilizations. And they were very influential, as I've been saying all along. But so little is known about them. Where did the word Olmec come from? I'm not entirely certain where the term first originated. And who predated the Olmecs, for example? This is something that we don't know in terms of what was a name, how do we distinguish these people. Highly developed technical skills, magnetic compass, for example, skill with iron, complex drainage systems. Again, we're looking at similar advances in civilization that we can see, for example, with the Toltec, the Teotihuacan, with Mexica, with the Maya. Complex mathematics, and again complex calendric systems, which is probably where the Maya and later civilizations inherited their calendric systems from. But what is particularly interesting about the Olmecs is they built these heads, and there are many, many, many of these heads. They're made of hard stone, and they're huge. Here's an image, for example. It looks quite an old photograph of one of them being unearthed there. Colossal heads. They're enigmatic and particularly interesting in their own way, but they have been explored as possibly having African features. And if they have African features, then that's a clear indication of possible interoceanic communication. Whether they are African or not, we don't know, because there's no other evidence to suggest. But certainly it has been a line of inquiry that these Olmec heads are representative of African people. They may not be, who knows? But there's another question related to the Olmec, and that is the use of the bearded figures. And this is again something we'll see in the Andean regions with the figure of Viracocha. And this is something we'll be talking about in 2 weeks' time, when we look at the possibility that Hernán Cortés capitalized on this legend of the returning bearded warrior Quetzalcoatl as part of his propaganda. But we'll come to that in 2 weeks' time. But nevertheless, this is 3,000 years old, perhaps, this stone figure, and it looks like he's bearded. And again, here we have another. They're very often referred to as Quetzalcoatl, bearded. Now, obviously, facial hair is something that's absent from the genetic makeup of almost all indigenous American people. And so consequently, whom does this represent? does it represent the possibility of communication with other peoples way back in time, before the time that people assumed that people were crossing oceans? I'll just throw that one out there. You can think about that yourselves. And also the other feature here is these peculiar figures, these jade figures with these elongated heads. Elongated heads, rather like the pyramids, it's something that comes up again and again and again. Not just in the Americas, but elsewhere in the world. In fact, if you've seen images of, for example, Akhenaten, one of the pharaohs, you'll see so many of the pharaohs are always depicted with these very long heads. It's a very peculiar feature of lots of ancient civilizations. And here's just some of these stone carvings. So there is Central America. There's a lot more we could talk about. We could talk about other cultures. We could talk about the Caribbean cultures. We could talk about the Arawak and the Siboney and the Taino, but unfortunately we haven't got that much time. I just wanted to concentrate on certain features of the Central American. Hopefully that sparked your interest in some of this, so we're now going to leap south. And again, we're going to leap south to South America. And again, I could talk about so many different peoples. We could talk about the peoples from the highlands of Colombia and Venezuela, of the Amazon. We could talk about all the way down to the Fuegians, the people down in Patagonia, right down in the frozen wastelands of the south, way down to Cape Horn. But I don't have time for this. So I'm going to concentrate specifically on the Andean people, the people from the Andes. And I'm going to start with the Inca. Rather like I started with the Aztec and move back in time, I'm going to start with the Inca. Because the Inca were the last great empire who were overthrown by the Spanish. And this was later than the Aztec. Francisco Pizarro, and we'll be talking about him in 2 weeks' time, he launched his great invasion of the Inca Empire in the 1530s. So after the time that Hernán Cortés had overthrown the Aztec. But the Inca Empire, again, we need to be careful about these terms. You know, who were the Inca? The Inca were the rulers. So the word Inca referred to the rulers, not to all the people. Because the Inca was an empire. And it was an empire that had expanded to a great extension, all the way down into Chile, modern-day Chile, way down into the south of Chile, and way up into modern-day Ecuador and perhaps even further north, following the great chain of the Andes Mountains, the great Cordillera of the Andes. And as we'll see, many different cultures and peoples were absorbed in the Inca Empire. Some were, in a way, destroyed. Again, you can look at parallels with the Roman Empire. Some cultures were taken over by the Inca and were absorbed and lost their cultural identity, but others retained their cultural identity, but just took on certain features of the Inca. We can see parallels with the Roman, although I think the Inca were far less ferocious than the Roman. But again, it's worth just looking at some of these parallels. So we'll start with the Inca. It's difficult to say exactly when the Inca first emerged, but nevertheless it looks like that they were at the height of the empire pretty much around the time of the discovery of, the time that Columbus was arriving. This was the time that they were at the height of their empire. And again, we need to just look at some of the features of this. We're talking about the Andes, which is an incredibly long mountain chain, with the Pacific Ocean to the west, with its particular climatic features of El Niño and La Niña, these two weather systems that can radically alter the climate over given periods of time. And then, obviously, to the east, the Amazon. So you've got the rainforest to the east, and you've got the Pacific Ocean to the west. And you've got this high mountain range with these high mesas, or plateaus, especially around Lake Titicaca, as we'll see in a minute, in Bolivia and in Peru. These are places of very distinct geographical features that will look at the rise and fall of different peoples there. This is the capital of the Inca, which is called Cusco. And Cusco is in Peru, and you can see here, and this is the first time I'm going to be showing, we'll be seeing many more of these images of these polygonal walls. And I'll raise the question as to whether they are actually Inca later on. At its height, the Inca Empire ruled an area extending from Ecuador, as I said, from Ecuador down to Argentina, comprising perhaps 12 million people. I mean, that's staggering. We're talking about an incredibly diverse range of people within the Inca Empire. How were they administered from the capital city? Well, in the same way that we can see the Roman Empire was administered from Rome. From a very, very intricate system of roads, networks of communication, tributes being paid by vassal states. Very, very complex, very complex. And we'll come to that in a minute. And it was 1533 that they were finally defeated by Pizarro. Well, sorry, it started in 1533 and it lasted a number of years into the 1570s and the final defeat of the Inca. But again, I'll come to that in a following, in a further presentation. Machu Picchu. Some of you may have heard of Machu Picchu. Actually, it should be pronounced Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu was discovered in 1911. This was the great Inca stronghold, the fortress way up in the mountain. Has anyone been to Machu Picchu? You have. Fantastic. You've been to all these places. It was discovered by an American explorer called Hiram Bingham in 1911. He was led there by a family. The city in the clouds. It's an extraordinary place. The architecture is predominantly Inca, in particular the terracing, as we'll see. But as I'll show a bit later, there is indication of pre-Inca architecture within the city itself. Here is an image of the ground plan of Machu Picchu. Now, the Inca roads, this is very extensive, and many of these Inca roads are still in existence today, and many have been obviously extended by modern road building techniques. But actually there are many parts of the Inca Trail which are still visible. You can see these paved roads through the mountains. Here's another image of through some quite inhospitable terrain. Very intricate system of communication. So messages could be passed across vast distances relatively quickly. Here are some suspension bridges. That technique of suspension bridges is still used, using lianas and other types of material that grow locally to cross these gorges and chasms. The farming terraces are very, very interesting and very extensive throughout the entire Andean region. Obviously the means of the method of creating terraces prevents the hillside being washed away, so you can actually cultivate very, very difficult terrain and produce quite a lot of abundant agriculture. And so the technique of building these terraces is a very complex one. And it's very extensive. I mean, all around Machu Picchu are these terraces. Extensive use of pottery. Here's one of depictions of maize, staple, one of the many staples of the Americas. And in particular the quipu. Now the quipu, again, it could have been the case, it's very likely that the Inca inherited the quipu. Unfortunately, the quipu were largely destroyed by the Spanish. I mean, they burned very well. The quipu are knotted cords, and it is a writing system. It is a form of recording information. Now, some people have suggested that they were purely administrative, so they are kind of like an ancient sort of spreadsheet, you know, recording taxes and tributes and you know, facts and figures about agriculture and about this and that and the other. But they could also have been storytelling techniques. They could have actually encoded some very, very complex narratives, but it's not entirely certain because a lot of them haven't been deciphered, and the actual script of the quipu has mostly been lost, and a lot of them have been destroyed. But nevertheless, this is related to that extensive communication network, plus mummification. Now, mummification was something that the Inca absolutely inherited from previous cultures, and we'll see the use of mummies, the technique of mummification goes back many thousands of years in the Americas. Here are some other images of gold and silver. the Spanish were obsessed with Inca gold and silver and took back tons and tons and tons and tons of it to Spain. And unfortunately, well, you can see when we talk about the Spanish in the Americas, we're generally talking in very unfavourable language. But so much of this, what they simply do is melted it down. So imagine the cultural richness that the Spanish found in the Americas. And such that has been preserved. We can see its intricacy and its fine craftsmanship. But of course, what they generally did was, wherever they found the gold and silver, they melt it down and take it back to Spain as ingots. So as bars. So all that incredible craftsmanship has been lost in most cases. So that's the Inca. Again, rather like the Aztec, the Mexica, there's so much more we could talk about the Inca, so much more. But I want to cover some of these. I don't want this to be a long catalogue, so I'm not suggesting that you need to learn all these names. Who were the Chimu and when were they and where were they? I'm doing this for your general sort of background knowledge, and I'm hoping to sort of burst a whole few bubbles that you might have, or ideas that you might have about the antiquity of the Americas. We can see lots of different peoples here, and again the same issue with names. So remember, these names are always going to be provisional, as are their dates. We'll start with the Moche. First of all, you can see where we are here. We're up in Peru, moving up into Ecuador, and you can see this is the Andes here, and these are all the westerly flowing rivers coming down off the Andes. Many of them moving all the way down. And we'll see different cultures forming in different valleys along these river valleys. We're going to concentrate here at the Moche. We'll be looking at others in due course. I'm not going to talk too much about the Moche. These sites were located along that arid desert land. This is now off the highland. This is down on the coastal plateaus. And pyramids. Many, many pyramids. The use of alpaca and llama were the only herded but not really domesticated. They were used for pack animals up in the Andes. But the use of pyramids. The Moche, for example, it's generally assumed that they were from around 100 to around 800 of the Common Era. Those are the dates that have been established by archaeologists. Again, it's not entirely clear when they began and whether they identified themselves as Moche. But what they did do was build these pyramids. They had successive periods of drought and then relocation. But this one, for example, the Huaca del Sol, again, like so many of these places, it wasn't even known to be a pyramid at first. It was seen as just a mountainside that had certain carvings. But this is a full pyramid. Huaca del Sol, in the Moche region, not far from Trujillo in modern Peru. Massive, but made of sandstone, made of the local stones, so therefore it's suffered tremendous erosion over the years. Plus, it would have been plundered by different people. And this is Huaca de la Luna. This is the inside part of the Huaca de la Luna. You can see the very, very elaborate ceramics there in the inside. There's a lot we could talk about these temples and the Moche people. This is the outside of the Huaca de la Luna. Very interesting symbolism. And again, very difficult to interpret these symbols. Are they hieroglyphs? Are they actually explaining particular narratives? Are they telling stories? If so, what are these stories? Are they cosmological stories? Are they cultural stories of battles and of leaders? What are these stories? Very difficult for anyone from the modern world to understand, because so much has been lost. So much has been lost. The Sican. The Sican state was centered around the Lambayeque Valley in northern Peru. This is between around 900 and 1370. So these were people who were absorbed into the Inca. And it's likely that the Sican people were absorbed into not the Inca, but the Chimu culture. Again, we needn't get too carried away by who, where, what, when. I don't really want this to be a history lesson in the sense of make sure exactly you know who invaded the Sican. That's not the issue. I just want to sort of show you some of this dazzling wealth of history of this region. And the Sican, of course, centered in the valley of Tucumé. And Tucumé, look at this, at least 26 pyramids there. You can see the obviously the great decay of these pyramids, made of the sandstone, rather like the Huaca del Sol and the Huaca de la Luna of the Moche. These Sican pyramids were very, very big, very big. But you wouldn't necessarily know they were a pyramid. Look at that. It looks just like a sort of a fairly chaotic mountain. Here's an artist's reconstruction of what they may have looked like at the time. I think that's a very powerful one. It's quite eerie, isn't it? Imagine coming across that landscape. Now, the story goes that they continued to build these pyramids because as successive rulers came to power, they would dismantle the previous pyramid and build their own one as an indication of their power. Again, these are stories that have been passed on over time, and so there's, it's very difficult to establish the truth of the matter, but certainly this is an area covered in these ruined pyramids of great size and of great extension. Very mysterious, very mysterious. So that's the Sican. Move on to the Chimu. You can see we're all in the same area here. Look, there's the Lambayeque, that's where the Sican were. Down here was where the Moche were. So now we're looking at the Chimu or the Chimor, centered in Chan Chan, near Trujillo, and this is around 1,000 to nearly the 1500s of the Common Era. So again, this was a society that survived into the post-conquest days, although the likelihood is the Spanish found them already, the culture had already deteriorated by the time the Spanish arrived. And they built their capital at Chan Chan, just north of the city of Trujillo. And this is the largest pre-Columbian city in Peru. And it covers an extension of about 28 square kilometers. It's huge. And it must have housed many thousands of people. They were absorbed, the Chimu people were absorbed by the Inca in around the late 1400s. So you can see that again, we're not always attributing the loss of the Central American peoples to the Spanish. These cultures came and went a long time before, some of them, or soon before. Chan Chan is still being excavated and explored. It's huge. Look at all this. What an extraordinary place. Made of sandstone, obviously quite deteriorated because of the use of this stone. Look at these strange motifs, these kind of fish that are sort of swimming all the way across. A very mysterious place. Look at these fellas guarding the entrance there. These strange figures, and we'll see similarities between these figures and other figures, other statues across South America. Here are some other images of Chan Chan, rather like the Huaca del Sol and the Huaca de la Luna, these strange motifs and images on the outside. Moving on, I hope you're enjoying this, Chiribaya. Chiribaya, we've got these rough dates again, absorbed by the Inca. The legend is that the Chiribaya were a non-hierarchical and non-warlike people, but again, it's not entirely clear. They lived in one of these river valleys, and in particular, what we know about the Chiribaya was the use of mummification, and in particular, a very distinctive feature of putting a ceramic pot, in the abdomen of the mummy. Very interesting, looking at these mummified skeletons. Well, they're not skeletons, well, mummified people. What were the techniques and why, and what were the rituals and the practices attached and the ceremonies attached to the mummification? Not much is known about the Chiribaya. Here are some of the textiles and the pottery, quite intricate on both accounts. That's quite a nice figure that I quite like him. He's quite funny. I'm moving on quite quickly. These are the Chachapoya. What an extraordinary people these were. The Chachapoya held out against the Inca for a long time. And the reason is they're way up in the mountains, way up on the eastern mountains of the Andes, so overlooking the Amazon, overlooking the Amazonian basin. So we're moving away from that coastal region. We're now moving on to the other side of the Amazon, of the Andes. But the Chachapoya, they weren't really explored until the 20th century. They're often called the warriors of the clouds, living way up in the Amazonas region. of present-day Peru. What's known about the Chachapoya? Well, that's their environment. It's a fairly bleak and hostile environment, and they were way up there. Look at that. In the 20th century, some explorers saw that. They hadn't been discovered, they hadn't been explored before. They saw that way up in the high hills. The city up in the mountains, but way up in the mountains, in the high crags. Look at that. Isn't that crazy? These funny statues, these huge statues which are built of a different stone that have been hauled up there. Look at that. And these statues are the guardians of a very extensive network of caves, high up in the mountains, in which many mummies were found. And these are mummies that have been brought down to a museum. But these mummies were all wrapped up. And so when they've been explored, their mummies are all in a sitting position, in a sort of a fetal position, and were wrapped up. Very strange. This was their citadel, one of their citadels, the Soloko, and you can see quite how extensive it is. These massive stone walls moving all. That's not a very good photo of that. Moving all around the mountainside. And here's another image of the gateway moving up into Soloko Fortress. And here's Cuela, again high up in the mountains. The use of round houses and round buildings, very extensive, very mysterious. Nobody really knows who they were. Nobody knows what some of the buildings were used for, whether they were all habitations or whether they had other functions. I'm moving on. I appreciate that time is running out. I hope you guys are enjoying this. I'm sorry if it seems very long and you're just sort of throwing lots of images at you, but I find it fascinating. Nazca. Has anyone heard of the Nazca before? Oh yeah, Nazca. What do we know about the Nazca? Were they even called the Nazca? This is the most mysterious of all, I find. Actually, I find a lot of it mysterious. First of all, the Nazca were expert potters, as we've seen with other cultures, such as the Chachapoya. I like this one on the right. It looks like an eclipse of the sun by the moon. Could well be. Fine textiles, as with other Andean cultures, and mummies. So the use of this practice of mummification of the dead, plus pyramids. So again, like I said earlier in the presentation, the use of pyramids, the building of pyramids all over the Americas is quite astonishing. This is a pyramid at Kawachi in the Nazca region, and another image of it. You can see how big it is. And here you can see how ruined some of these pyramids are. This is rather similar to that valley of Tucume that I showed you earlier, of the Sican, which, I would think of the desert winds blowing across these for hundreds and hundreds of years, and have been very badly destroyed and eroded. Here's a reconstruction of what they could have looked like. I mean, just imagine being there when it looked like that. It looks very different to the cityscapes that we know of Europe, of medieval London or medieval Paris, or even ancient Rome. These places are very strange. What were the pyramids for? What took place in these pyramids? What are the peculiar functions of these buildings? However, what Nazca is perhaps most famous for are the immense geoglyphs. Geoglyphs being figures in the landscape. Has anyone come across the Nazca lines before? I mentioned Nazca, but has anyone ever come across the Nazca lines? You have? Oh yeah. Wow, in which case you guys hopefully will be dazzled by this. First of all, let's just talk about this. You can see there's the hummingbird. I'll talk a little bit more about the hummingbird later. But let's just first talk about this. This is weird. This mountain has been leveled. That mountain has been flattened. How did they do that? We talk about huge feats of civil engineering in the modern world where mountains are, quarried and, all sorts of quite extensive remodeling of the landscape. But how the hell did they flatten that mountain? What tools did they use? They didn't have big JCBs and Caterpillar machines that we have today. Mysterious. But then, what are these great geoglyphs? Here is one. That is an entire hillside. You know, it would take you a long time to walk up there. This is a figure, sometimes called the Owl Man, sometimes called the Giant, sometimes called an alien. You know, who is he? What does he represent? Here is the spider. But notice it's not just these zoomorphic figures. We've also got these peculiar landscape markings right the way across this terrain. Very peculiar. The spider, there he is. The condor, a bit difficult to see in that picture, but here's a better one. Sorry, that's the hummingbird. The condor. You can see there's his beak, there's his wings, there's his tail, and so on and so forth. But again, you can still see these peculiar other lines and diagonal lines in the landscape. But you can't see these from the ground. They can only be seen from the air. I'll leave that to your imagination. Why on earth would these geoglyphs be built, which are so intricate, which can't even be seen? There is the hummingbird. There is the heron. Very stylized, as you can tell. I mean, they're zoomorphic, but they're fairly weird. There's another image of the heron. The pelican. You can see his peculiar big beak out there. And there's his wings. Strange. But you can see also that the pelican is being dissected or bisected by this big, strange geometric figure in the landscape there. This peculiar figure, I think this is the one I'm referring to as the hands. Look at that! What the hell is that? Isn't it weird? He's like, whatever it is, it's got 4 fingers there and 5 fingers there and 4 fingers there. What kind of crazy beastie is he? What was it? Who designed these and why? There's the monkey. Some of you may have seen that before. I've seen that on a T-shirt before. Look at his lovely labyrinthine tail. And these are colossal. These are huge. These are like they would cover 7 or 8 football pitches. They're massive. Yes.
How are the pictures like showing that the lines, are they built up or?
No, they're
down?
half a foot down. So they've been sort of carved in the landscape, and some of them have got little, runnels of stones to mark them. I mean, there's a similarity. Obviously, we have geoglyphs in the landscape. The white horses, the white horse of Uffington, the long man of Wilmington. Some of you may have seen him in Sussex, or the Cerne Abbas giant, who's got a big erect phallus. Some of you may have seen him down in Dorset. There are lots of geoglyphs in our landscape. None of them are quite like this, and all of our geoglyphs can be seen from neighbouring hills, but these can't. There's a satellite image. You can see the valley there. And look at this. Look at all these peculiar markings. What on earth are they? Okay, here again, that's a bit of a pixie, of a grainy image there. Here, I'm just flicking randomly through these. This is the dog, or the, I don't know what he's called actually. I think he's a kind of dog. There's just a labyrinth, a circle. So here you can see, unfortunately this map doesn't have a scale, but that's the Pan-American Highway. They built it right through the landscape and right through a couple of these figures. You can see there's the hummingbird up there, there's the monkey. I mean, this is big. Extraordinary place. But that's not all, because just recently there have been a whole lot more of these geoglyphs discovered in a neighbouring plateau. So it goes on and on. And there's a link, but I don't have time to go into that now. But again, that's not all. This peculiar band of holes in the Pisco Valley, this is in the Nazca region. This goes on for mile after mile after mile after mile after mile. What are they? They're holes. There, look at that. They're holes. If anyone's been to Tenerife, they look a bit like the holes in which has the vineyards. Has anyone been to Tenerife? No, I don't mean Tenerife, Lanzarote. Yeah, did you see the vineyards? They have holes in the ground in the volcanic earth, and then they have one vine per hole. Well, it's a bit like that, but it goes on for mile after mile after mile. Look at that, across the hills. What on earth are they? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. So I'm not giving you an explanation because I have none. Furthermore, they were very, very accomplished civil engineers in relation to here bringing water down from the Andes onto the plateau. So here, these are these access points. And you can see down the bottom the water that's flowing, and that is water that is actually being channeled from the high Andes, many, many miles away. So it's bringing fresh water, fresh, cold mountain water. Here you can see an area of a whole lot of them. Now, obviously, modern agriculture and not least the Spanish, so much of these have obviously been destroyed. But again, you've got this peculiar feature of why are so many so close together? If they're access holes, what really are they? So strange, so strange. That's the Nazca. I'd love to spend longer talking about the Nazca, but I've got to move on. Paracas. Paracas is on the coast. You can see this is the actual Pacific here. This is a peculiar geoglyph. It's massive. It's the whole mountainside, often called the candelabra. Nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows really who the Paracas culture were either. They're called Paracas because this area is called Paracas. And there it is. A bit difficult to see. This is in northern Peru. But the thing about the Paracas is the elongated skulls. Now, this is an image from the Paracas Museum. Skull elongation is a feature across the world. Like I mentioned earlier, Akhenaten, for example, and many of the Egyptian pharaohs had elongated skulls. And the practice of skull deformation is fairly well documented, and that is between about 4 and 14 months. The skull is very malleable, and you probably know the fontanelle, the soft spot on the top of a baby's head. And if a skull is bound with bits of wood at the front and back, it can obviously grow in a different way, and it doesn't affect the intelligence, it doesn't affect the brain. It's one of those many practices that people do of body deformation all over the world, such as the copper rings with the women in Borneo, such as big earlobes. I mean, body deformation is something that's practiced in all different cultures, including our own. And there are many deformed skulls, or elongated skulls, found in many parts of the world, which quite clearly show the practice of skull deformation. And some of the skulls in the Paracas Museum do so as well. But as far as my investigations have taken me, the ones in Paracas are very weird. And the reason they're weird is because, for two reasons. First of all, they have a different skull formation in terms of the plates. If you see a skull, you'll see that there is the plate that goes across. You know, your skulls are made of different bits of bone, and they come together and they form these joints, and you can see that in any skull. But these guys have a completely different skull formation. Notice it's completely smooth. It's one piece. But furthermore, they're much, much bigger. So that's to say, skull deformation can change the shape of a skull, but it can't increase its volume. You can't make the head bigger. But these skulls are much, much bigger, and there are many of them. And they're still being discovered. You know, there are still caves in remote parts of this area of Paracas where these skulls are found, mummified skulls, and they belong to mummified bodies. What on earth are we dealing with here? And here's an image of a possibility of what these people may have looked like alongside the skull. The other thing is red hair, which is a genetic feature only of these skulls. It's not something that's found with American people anywhere. Now, I'm aware of the time. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I'll try and wrap this up fairly quickly. What the hell are we dealing with here? What I find particularly unnerving about this is if we are dealing with a genetically distinct race of humans, which is possible, you would have thought that people would have been queuing up to do genetic tests on the skulls, and yet they're not. There's a lot of mystery attached to this. There's a lot of speculation, and it's being carried out by amateurs as opposed to by established geneticists or archaeologists. The whole thing just constitutes a strange sort of blind spot in our knowledge of ancient peoples. Are these a different race of humans? If so, then what? Or are they simple skull deformation? But even then, if so, how to account for the increased volume and this very different skull formation? Furthermore, if it's a particular genetic mutation, how was it cultivated to such a particular degree? And then last of all, what are the connections with other skull deformations around the world? And what's its relationship with this legend of mimicking the gods. This is a very peculiar one. I don't want to go into any more depth here, but so many of the stories talk about the fact that the skull deformations took place and the elongation in order to resemble the gods. Does that indicate that there were manifestation of gods in some respect, or I leave this to your imagination, but what really does this mean? I'm going to try and wrap up fairly quickly. This is the last thing I want to talk about, not just this place, but I want to now get into the question of megaliths. This is Sacsayhuaman. This is just north of Cusco. This is, in fact, it's just above Cusco in Peru. Legend has it that this was built by the Inca, but what we see here are these incredible polygonal walls. Now, the question of the polygonal walls, I can talk about this for a long, long time. These polygonal walls are made of very hard stone, of andesite, which is incredibly tough volcanic stone, with a very high, dense crystal. And yet these stones have been fitted together. They're massive. Some of them are many hundreds of tons, and they have been fitted together with such absolute precision that nobody knows how it was done. Full stop. And I'm insistent about that. They didn't have the modern technology that we have. They didn't have these diamond cutting drills and other types of technology. And yet these stones have been fitted with miraculous precision. They were cut and shaped. If you wanted to do that out of any material, it would take you a long time. If you wanted to do that out of clay, well, clay is different because you could mould it, but if anything you had to carve, just imagine the difficulty of getting these many different sides and faces, these multifaceted stones, to fit together, to lock together. And at no point can you even slide a piece of paper. How did they do it? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Now look at this. We've got mysteries all around the place. We've got mysteries of infinity, and mysteries of is there life on other planets, and mysteries about birth and death, and all these mysteries. But we don't have many mysteries which are factual, concrete ones in terms of human history. We don't have many things. I mean, it's quite miraculous how the building of Gothic cathedrals in the 11th and 12th centuries. It's quite amazing how these guys suddenly got together and built these amazing cathedrals. It's quite amazing how many things have been built in the ancient world. But when it comes to these polygonal stone walls, all around the world showing similar motifs, the question is unanswered. Nobody knows how they did it. We are talking categorically, and this is not me going off in some wild speculation, we are talking about a lost technology. Full stop. And I challenge anyone to present a feasible, plausible explanation of how these were done, because there is none at the moment. There are questions of, and it's not just about the fitting, it's about the moving as well. These stones, and this is something I'll come to now, I've got to move on a bit quickly. See how big some of them are? This is Sacsayhuaman, but I'm going to move on. Tiwanaku. Again, unfortunately, Tiwanaku, we don't know anything about the Tiwanaku people. We know nothing about the Tiwanaku people. This is very close to Lake Titicaca, only a few miles from Lake Titicaca, and there's evidence to suggest that the waters of Lake Titicaca used to wash against the temple here. Again, massive architecture, huge stones. But what's particular? I'm going to flick through this. Sorry, I'm going to flick through all of this. I'm sorry. Huge. This is also very reminiscent of Egyptian architecture, and Babylonian architecture, and ancient architecture from many other parts of the world. Pyramid here at Tiwanaku. There's an artist's reconstruction of the pyramid. But I want to look now at Pumapunku. Pumapunku is just by, you can see there, it's just in the same place as Tiwanaku. But Pumapunku is one of the greatest mysteries of all. I mean, people keep going there, geologists, engineers, and they keep going to Pumapunku and going, what the hell is this? This is, again, very hard andesite. And yet look at this intricate carving. This can only be done with the most advanced, high precision implements, tools that we have in the modern world. And even then, it's unlikely we'd get such a finish. Look at this. You cannot do that with bronze tools. You cannot do that with stone tools. You can't even do it with iron tools or steel tools. There's no evidence that they had steel, so we can discount steel. Nobody knows how they did it. And look at this. This is a massive, massive, massive slab. It would have been hundreds of tons. It is hundreds of tons. And it is absolutely perfect. The variance from across these corners is thousandths of an inch. It is totally flat and polished, so smooth that could, again, you cannot do with any of the technology that we ascribe the ancients as having had. You cannot do it. Look at this. This is a massive andesite stone. Well, it's not massive, you can see the size of a dandelion there. But this particular hole, and it's not a hole that you could do with a drill either, because it's not straight, it's curved. How did they do it? Nobody knows. I'm baffled by this. I'm mystified. Look at these edges. Absolutely precise edges. And this is a very, 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 very hard stone. It's like granite. Look at that. These drill holes. And these grooves with further drill holes. You know, what the hell was Pumapunko? What the hell is it? There is a modern set square set against it to show its precision. It's absolutely perfect, you know. I mean, Tiwanaku and Pumapunko, I mean, please explore further. Nobody knows what's going on there. Nobody even knows what these places are. I mean, was it a temple? If so, is it a temple in the same way we talk about a Christian temple, a church? Or is it actually something related to energy, matter, time? Who knows? And last of all, this issue of using the word Inca. So many of these places are called Inca. Even, you know, Ollantaytambo, for example, here. Ollantaytambo. Inca, that's highly likely that is Inca. Very intricate carvings in the hillside, these terraces. Very mysterious place. Mysterious anyway, whether it's Inca or not, it's mysterious. But then as we go up to the top, so built on top of these terracings, so the indication being that perhaps it predates the Inca, are these megalithic polygonal walls. And they're very peculiar as well. They have these buttresses. You'll see these sort of these knobs that don't seem to have any practical function. And you can see there that as you get further up to the very top of Ollantaytambo, these colossal stones. Now these have been dragged, they've been brought there from many, many miles away. How? How do you move a stone like this? I've got about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to wrap up with the last thing. Oh, this is the Nyaupa Iglesia. This is high up in the mountains. Look at that. Again, it's rather like Pumapunko. Carving in the hard stone. I'm going to have to skip through this. Look at that. It looks modern, doesn't it? This is way up in the mountains, in a cave. Look at that. How the hell did they do that? So the question that I'm proposing is that many of these places are pre-Inca, and that the Inca, including Cusco, this is Cusco, and Machu Picchu, the Inca inherited them. And in fact, you can see Inca architecture up above there. You can see the wall building of the Inca up on top. Look at that. What the hell is that? Looks like something out of Salvador Dali. Yeah. That's in Machu Picchu. Polygonal megalithic walls in Inca sites. Here's Indipunco. Again, you can see the Inca stone architecture on top and the what's highly likely to be pre-Inca at the bottom. Now, the reason I'm showing this and the reason I'm focusing on this is because I am not convinced, but I'm entertaining the possibility, as are many others, that there was a very, very extensive communication of cultures across the world, across the entire world, of great, great, great technological and cultural sophistication, going back many thousands of years, perhaps even predating the last ice age. And these megalithic walls, these polygonal walls, could well be a feature. Here you can see 3 lines: Easter Island, Egypt, South America. I'm being very quick here, forgive me. But also, here, for example, this is the largest megalith that's known at the moment. This is called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. This is in Baalbek in Lebanon. These were moved. These were moved. This is like 1,500 tons. I mean, we're familiar with these stones from our own. This is you know, this used to be called a Roman wall. It's the same sort of situation. That's Roman. This is pre-Roman, but this has always been called Roman. This is Baalbek in Lebanon. You know, the Romans did this. The Romans didn't do this any more than the Inca. Who did it? And what's the similarity between these sites? Look at that. This is the unfinished obelisk in Aswan. Look at the size of that. Again, it's approaching 1,000 tons. At least it's estimated to be. Here's one a picture I took. This is my wife years ago. This is in Dol de Bretagne in Brittany. Again, this goes well underground, and there are megaliths all over our landscape, even here in Kent. Here's some other example of that fine stoneworking. This is in Egypt. A drill hole at Karnak in Egypt. Sorry, I'm rushing. Look at that, another very, very fine use of granite, but so fine. This is in Saqqara in Egypt, and very similar to Pumapunko. Pyramids around the world. I'll just finish with this. There are pyramids all over the world. Indonesia, similar designs. Here's underwater. Oh, I've got to move. I've got to stop now. I can keep going. Unfortunately, I've left myself no time. What I really want to do today is just spark your interest. And I wanted to start with a question of Latin America, but as we go back in time, I haven't really managed to get to the end there, to expand our horizons to the possibility that there was communication across the globe way back in ancient times. I'll leave it at that. I hope you've enjoyed that. Muchas gracias. See you in 2 weeks' time. I'll put this PowerPoint on the Moodle page.